Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And Lyle, thank you. Thank you for the lovely introduction. It was really sweet. He was working on that a lot backstage. I helped him on a few key lines. So when I was working on Dangerous Animals Club, Simon & Schuster had me up in New York, and we were talking, and my editor called me up shortly afterwards and said, well, you know, there's so many spiritual elements to your stories. How would you feel about writing a book about spiritual stories? And I was like, I said, but they asked me to write a book, so I said, absolutely yes. In my life, I have never known a person who said that they weren't spiritual in some way or another, and hence the title, My Adventures with God. And one thing I observed, and I don't know if this is true or not, but this was kind of the basis of the book, is that all of our lives, at least everybody I talk to, kind of fall down into the template of the Old Testament. You've got Genesis, where everybody has stories that they usually tell other people on their first date of where they came from and who their family was, and powerful creation stories. And then we all go into slavery or graduate school. Then we have this moment in the middle of our lives, the Leviticus moment, where we say, this is what I am, and then some of us make a mid-course correction. And then death enters our life in very personal ways, where if you follow the Tobolowsky Files, you know the stories of losing my mother, and we're changed like in the book of Numbers. And then we have what we have tonight, is Deuteronomy, where Moses retold the stories to the children of Israel, because they probably forgot what their journey was about. So I'm doing 3 stories from the new book tonight that I don't think anyone has ever heard. In fact, I know one of them my wife has not even heard. This first story is called The Bargain, and it is from the Exodus section of the book. And to understand this story historically, you have to kind of remember back that in the late 1970s, everyone was a part-time drug dealer. Your relatives, your teachers, strangers waiting in line with you at the movies, everybody. If they had some extra marijuana and you wanted some, they would sell it to you. And this wasn't as heinous as it sounds, because back then marijuana was not considered a drug. It existed somewhere on the pharmacological spectrum between rum and extra-strength Tylenol. Selling marijuana was considered an act of charity, helping those who did not have the means to provide their own hallucinations. We operated under the concept that it took a village to keep you high. At this time, I was making a living performing children's theater in Los Angeles in the school system. We did educational plays about how great it was to be black or to be a woman. As a white man, I was thrilled I got the job. There was nothing like starting your day with a bit of irony. Work finished at around noon, and after lunch, I moved into phase 2 of my day, which was playing Scrabble until dinner time. And then phase 3 began in the evening when I grabbed my Stratocaster guitar and got together with my friend T-Bone, and we headed for a garage deep in the San Fernando Valley, and we rehearsed with our band, the LA Slugs, preparing for our improbable future as rock stars. Inertia is a strange concept. It is both movement and rest. It's a scientific way of saying that it's very hard to change. We often mistake forward motion with harnessing the means to keep everything the same. In this particular time in my life, I required large amounts of marijuana to keep perambulating at the same pace. At band practice, we kept complaining about the scarcity of pot of sufficient quality to motivate us to rehearse. And I don't think the pot made us play better. It made us play slower, which meant that we were all probably playing the same part of the song at the same time. I booked a trip to Dallas, Texas to visit my mom and my dad. My friend T-Bone told me that if I was willing, he could hook me up with an acquaintance of his who could provide us with high-quality weed at discount superstore prices. I didn't think twice about it. I asked what I had to do. T-Bone said he would put me in touch with Albert. I would give Albert money, he would give me weed, and I would bring it back on the plane. That's simple. It sounded like a straightforward transaction to me. I agreed. I talked to the guys in the band. Everyone was enthusiastic. T-Bone said if there was enough interest, Albert could get us a whole pound of marijuana. Each member of the band would throw in some money, everyone would get a chunk, and then we would have enough left over to sell to lower our overhead. It made all of the sense in the world. Unfortunately, there were several things I had not taken into account. These were important things. I would be transporting a pound of marijuana. That was a felony. In Texas, it was worse. For a pound of marijuana, they throw you into Seagoville prison where you enter a leading man and exit a character actor. The next oversight was that unwittingly, this would move me from the category of being an amateur drug dealer to being a professional drug dealer. And nothing is as fun when you go pro. Finally, I assumed that meeting someone named Albert would be a walk in the park for the simple reason that I liked the name. I had positive associations with Albert Einstein, Albert Camus, Francis Albert Sinatra. I couldn't wait to see what this new Albert would bring into my life. All T-Bone told me was that Albert was serious and you didn't want to mess around with him. Well, I didn't know what mess around meant. It would be terrible to mess around with someone and not be aware that you were messing. T-Bone said, just be sure you have the money, all of the money. Albert spent some time in prison. He won't like it if you're short. I'll have all the money before I leave, I said. Nothing could go wrong. T-Bone looked at me with what I now identify as second thoughts. He reiterated and said, just call him when he says to call him. Do what he says to do, exactly what he says to do. Don't joke around with him. He won't want to spend a lot of time with you. He's not friendly, but he is honest. You won't have to worry about Albert double-crossing you, taking the money and the dope and leaving you in a ditch somewhere. Just remember, he's serious. I left for Dallas with a telephone number in my wallet. Mom and Dad picked me up at the airport. Mom was thrilled I was home for a visit. I could tell because all we did was talk about food. She gave me a rundown of when we were going to eat brisket and all of her other specialties. When we got to the house, I headed for my sister's old bedroom. Barbie's bed was just as uncomfortable as any bed in the house, but it did have several advantages. It was a double bed, so it was uncomfortable times two. And my sister's room also had the only private telephone in the house. Before I opened my suitcase, I pulled out the phone number from my wallet. I dialed. A man with a Texas accent was on the other end of the line. Hello? Yes, hello. Is this Albert? I said. There was a pause followed by, who is this? This is Stephen Tobolowsky. T-Bone gave me this number and said I could call Albert. Yeah, this is Albert. I heard from T-Bone. You got everything? Yes, sir. Okay. I'll meet you tonight at 9:50 in the parking lot of the Castle Inn Theater. You know where that is? Yes, sir. You be there at 9:50 sharp. The 8 o'clock feature will be letting out. The 10 o'clock feature will be going in. The parking lot will be busy. No one will notice us. I will be in a red pickup truck. When you see me, you come to the truck. You understand? Yes, sir. He hung up. I got the idea that one of the defining factors of being serious was a lack of banter. Well, that was done. Phone call made. I felt relieved, got that out of the way. My self-satisfaction lasted for about 3 seconds when the stress hit me that inevitably comes with talking without thinking. How was I going to get to the Castle Linda Theater? I didn't have a car. Well, obviously, I could borrow a car from Mom or Dad. That would be easy. They went to bed early. We finished dinner. Mom and I went into the den to watch TV. We turned on one of her favorite shows, Those Amazing Animals. We watched a gorilla talk in sign language and a pangolin catch ants. Mom said, "You know, Stephen, those animals really are amazing." I said, "Yeah, Mom, that's why they have their own show." It was 8 o'clock. A sitcom started. I had to pop the question soon. It already seemed weird that I needed a car so late. I yawned and said, "Hey, Mom, think I need to borrow the car tonight." Mom looked at me and said, "Tonight?" "Yeah, right, in just a little bit." "Well, where are you going? You just got into town." Nowhere. Going nowhere. Just wanted to say hello to some friends." "Well, who?" "I don't know." Well, they're friends of T-Bone's. They were doing a show tonight, and I promised I would just say howdy after the show. "Right. Well, that's late." "I know." "Well, I bet they'd understand if you saw them tomorrow for lunch." "Well, possibly, Mom, but I said I would see them tonight." "Okay, sweetheart." And she got the keys from her purse and handed them to me. "Thanks, Mom. Don't stay out late." "Oh, I'm sure I won't." We sat, we rocked, we watched some TV. Then Mom said, "Can I go with you?" The problem with thinking on your feet is you never know in advance when you have to use your brain. Usually, some other major organ is working at the same time. I stammered a little and said, "No, Mom, no, really. I'd probably be able to get out of there quicker if I just go there and say hello. Come back." Mom thought about it a second and relented. "All right." It's hard being an outlaw when you don't even have the skills to make a clean getaway from your mother. We watched some more television. The sitcom laugh track punctuated my growing dread. My sense of time became distorted, stretched like a ghastly Halloween mask. I watched the clock. 8:25, 8:50. 9:10, 9:17. I had crawled into an Alfred Hitchcock movie of my own making. I had to go. I kissed Mom goodnight, headed for the car. I got in the little maroon Buick, turned on the engine. Wait, my wallet. Did I have it? I checked. I did. The money. I pulled it out. I counted the bills by the dim light of the 40-watt garage bulb. It was all there. $1,200. Oh, that's a lot of money. Why was I doing this again? I headed for the Castle Linda Theater. I pulled into the parking lot on schedule at 9:48. First problem, the entire parking lot was empty. Empty. On the marquee was a sign, "Theater closed for private party." I guess another one of the defining characteristics of being serious is not checking on details. Or maybe it was a defining characteristic of someone who was serious who ends up in prison. I waited for a few minutes, and a dirty red pickup truck pulled into the lot near me. I jumped out of the car. Albert rolled down his window. My first impression of the man was not an entire face, just a cowboy hat, a curly red beard, and a mouth. I was about to speak when we had a second problem. A police car swung into the parking lot next to Albert's truck. Albert yelled, "Shit, we gotta get out of here, follow me." Albert gunned his engine and headed for the street. I pulled out, followed Albert. Policeman pulled out, followed me. This was before the age of cell phones, so I had no way of calling Albert to tell him the heat was on my tail. I couldn't abort the mission and run the risk of angering Albert. I couldn't continue on the mission and end up at the police station. I did what any person would do on their first uncertain steps toward felony possession. I began to cry. I followed Albert away from the city into the heart of darkness. I wasn't sure where we were, except there was a lot of foliage. I kept checking in the rear view. Johnny Law was still on my tail. I made sure I didn't break the speed limit. No need racking up a traffic violation along with jail time. Then, as if by magic, the police car stopped its pursuit, took a sharp turn away from me, vanished into the night, and I smiled to myself, probably got another call, bigger fish to fry. See you later, coppers. Now it was just Albert and me. I followed his taillights into the woods. He stopped at a small clearing. I stopped about 20 feet behind him. I got out of Mom's car and walked to the truck, and now I recognized where we were, White Rock Lake. Oh, it's so beautiful up here. Moonlight was shining across the water. The air hummed with crickets and cicadas. I climbed into the truck and got my first real view of Albert. He was a big man, hefty. He was wearing a leather vest with no shirt that exposed acres of hairy chest and stomach. He had little eyes that twinkled even in the dark. He was like the bad red-headed twin of Santa Claus. "How you doing?" he said. Fine." Albert smirked. His smirk revealed a considerable charm. "Pretty hairy back there, huh?" Yes, sir. Not used to that." Albert laughed a little. "Yeah, you never get used to that. So you're T-Bone's buddy, huh?" "Yep." He said, "You two got a band together?" "Yes, sir. We love it." "What do you play?" "Well, I play the guitar and sing some, and T-Bone plays the harp and sings. We both write songs." Albert shook his head. "Oh, man, I can't imagine T-Bone writing a song. What do you guys write about?" Screwing and getting high, basically." "Sounds like my kind of music. Let me get the stuff." Albert jumped out of the truck. He walked back to the bed and pulled up something the size of a large brick wrapped in foil. He sauntered back and handed it to me. "There you go. Grade A stuff. You got the money?" Yes, sir." I put the brick between my feet, reached into my back pocket for the wallet. My hands were shaking. I pulled it out, and miraculously, the money had not disappeared. There were several $100 bills, $1,200. I gave it to Albert. He smiled, counted it, folded it into the pocket of his greasy vest. "All there," he said. "If you guys need any more, you just let me know." "You bet." "So, how's T-Bone doing out there?" "Well, pretty good. He's got a day job, but we're both trying to get acting work. We love playing in the band. It's a lot of fun." "Well, I bet it is. You guys do any Lynyrd Skynyrd?" No, sir. We just do our own songs." Now, as much as I like jawboning with Albert, I really wanted to get home. My eye wandered over to the window, and I caught movement in the truck's side mirror. I tried to focus on it. It was the police. A lot of them, with guns drawn, creeping along the side of the truck. And the bad news was that on my mirror it said, "Warning, objects in mirror may appear closer than they are." I said, Albert, police are coming. They're beside the truck. They have guns." Albert sat motionless for a second as his brain sped through the Rolodex of his options. Then he calmly looked at me and said, "Kiss me." "What?" "Kiss me now." I leaned over and started kissing Albert. He gave me the tongue. You could tell a lot about a man when you French kiss him the first time. In Albert's case, I can tell that he smoked cigarettes and just had a barbecue sandwich with a beer for dinner. Albert began getting a little feely with his hands when the police jumped up on both sides of the truck and yelled, "Freeze!" It's remarkable how well that works. When the police point guns at you and yell, "Freeze," that is exactly what you do. Time seemed to stop until one of the policemen started laughing and said, Well, 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 what have we here? Romeo and Juliet. Out of the truck, boys. I wasn't sure what was worse, having a pound of marijuana wrapped in foil at my feet or being gay in Texas. The cops continued. So, which one of you's the girl? They looked at Albert, looked at me, settled on me. How you doing, sweetheart? I was getting weak in the knees. I muttered, fine. All the police gathered around me. No one was looking in the truck. What's your name? I never thought that question could tear me to pieces. What if this ended up in the paper? What would Mom and Dad say? Stephen, could I see some ID, Stephen? Yes, sir. I handed one of the policemen my driver's license. I guess my name was too long for them to tackle. They continued having fun with me. So what brings you two up here on this beautiful night? Well, sir, I just got in from Los Angeles. I used to live here, and I was staying at home with my parents, and I felt like I needed to get out and get some air, and it was such a nice night. I thought, you thought it would be nice to get it on with Charlie Daniels in the truck? I looked at Albert. He was expressionless. The ability to be a blank slate under duress, which could be another defining characteristic of being serious. The cops stopped grinning. One of them got in my face and spoke quietly. He spoke with professional menace. He was almost as terrifying as a dentist. He said, we don't like seeing you queers up here. You understand? I want you to go back home to Mama now, and I never, never want to see you up here again. No, sir. No, sir. Never. Next time we go to jail. Yes, sir. Thank you for the warning. The cops headed back to their car. I headed for mine and started the engine. Albert walked over and tapped on the glass. I rolled down the window. Remember, you got something in my truck still. Oh, right. I started to open the door. He stopped me. Maybe you should wait for the cops to drive away? Right. The police pulled out. I ran over, retrieved the brick, headed back to my car, and yelled out, thanks, Albert. Albert didn't reply. He just shook his head and headed home. I got back before 11 p.m., but like a Grimm's fairy tale, I had aged 1,000 years. I took the marijuana brick and jammed it down one of my Tony Lama boots. So that was over. Story done. Unless Mom decided to shine my boots in the morning, which was entirely possible. I hid the offending boot on the top shelf of my sister's closet. Mom would never see it up there. I hoped the smell of my sister's old Barbie dolls could cover the distinctive stench of the Mary Jane. I fell into bed, turned off the light, and in the darkness, I looked over to the closet and I trembled. And I prayed. It had been a long time since I prayed, many years, and this wasn't a very good prayer. It was more of a bargain. Most bargains with God happen when you've been too evil or too unlucky in your life. I added a third category, too stupid. I started talking to myself. Why? Why did you do this? You almost ruined your life. I answered me, well, except for breaking the law, you really did nothing wrong. You didn't hurt anyone. Marijuana is practically a vegetable. You gave Albert some money and a little affection, which could keep him out of trouble. You're just scared. Everything's going to be okay. And I said to me, no, it's not okay. I don't need drugs. I don't need to spend that kind of money. Please, I need to understand. Going to Seagoville would ruin my career. I just got an agent. Another voice entered the conversation, but this was a voice I was not familiar with. And it said, Stephen, you did not do this because of drugs or rock and roll or not letting down the guys. You did not do this because you were afraid of Albert. You already know why you did this. You learned the story. What story? I asked. Think about it. It was a long time ago, the voice responded. I don't know what you're talking about. Rabbi Klein taught it to you in kindergarten. Hint? Garden. Adam and Eve, I said? It's all there, said the other voice. I don't follow, I said. When you were little, you used to think the story of Adam and Eve was about disobeying God and eating an apple. That's the child's version. The real story is about man's addiction to danger. Adam and Eve had paradise. They knew what to do, but they listened to the snake. They preferred the snake. Why? I asked. Because they wanted fear more. What? Why did they want fear? That doesn't make sense. The other voice stopped. There was no answer. I continued talking to me. Listen, I don't want the fear. I'm done with it. Please, God, please hear me. I will be good from now on. Just take away the fear. Again, there was nothing. I went into a deep, dreamless sleep. Woke up the next morning feeling like I had just gotten off of an international flight. The rest of my visit was a blur. The day arrived for my return to Los Angeles. It was time for me to go back to the dreaded closet and fetch my boot. Now, how was I going to take this stuff to Los Angeles? I hadn't thought of this either. Well, first I had to take the foil off the brick. I knew that could trigger the alarms going through security. I was Albert-like in my lack of attention to detail. I was unaware that airports had things called drug-sniffing dogs. That's because I wasn't a drug dealer. I was unfamiliar with the pitfalls and snares awaiting people like me. I encased the brick of dope in a cocoon of plastic wrap. I only had carry-on, so there was no place to put the stuff but back in my boot. Mom and Dad drove me to the airport. I stood in line at security, put my bag on the conveyor belt to go through screening. Dad shook my hand. Mom hugged and kissed me. She told me to take care of myself. Alarms start going off, flashing lights. Airport policeman pulls my bag aside and says, "Excuse me, son, this yours?" He pointed to my carry-on. I nodded. The blood drained from my head. The officer began unzipping my bag. "You mind if I go through this?" "No, sir. Please, go on." At this point, I was ready to throw myself on the ground and plead for mercy before God and my parents. The rest of people in line at security screenings gathered to watch. He pointed to something in my bag. "This yours?" I saw a glint of foil. Impossible. I took all of the foil off, I think. Mom stepped forward and said, "Oh, that's mine." Mom walked up to the officer and looked back at me. "I made a banana nut bread for you, Stephen. I know it's your favorite, and I put it in your bag this morning." The policeman laughed and pulled out the loaf of bread and said, "Well, ma'am, you can't wrap anything in foil. It sets off the machine." Mom blushed and looked at the officer and said, "I'm sorry, does that mean he can't take it?" Policeman looked at me and said, "No, I think we could trust him with the banana nut bread." He gestured for me to go through the metal detectors. I waved goodbye to Mom and Dad and headed for my plane. As I watched the world pass beneath me on my way back west, my feelings with regret wrestled with my feelings of relief. They fought to a draw. The one question that wouldn't go away was the conversation I had with me that awful night when I bargained with God. Did I really want the fear? If so, I had succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. But why? I drew a blank. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. Maybe the answer would come to me. I know dreams are an unreliable guide, except when they're a guide for the unreliable. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, all of that was true. I hope Albert doesn't hear about this book. That, Simon & Schuster, they have their lawyers call you at the end, and I said, do you think I should change Albert's name? And they said, no, he doesn't sound like the type who'd read this. This is a story called The Unintended Consequences of Eden. It's from the middle section of the book, the Leviticus section, and it's one, I think this is the first time I've ever read it, ever. So it's a world premiere for you guys. The Unintended Consequences of Eden. I don't know when I knew. It wasn't a matter of looking in the mirror. It was something that crept up on me and became clearer over time. I was a traditionalist. The tip-off could have been that I liked the song Teen Angel. To like Teen Angel, you have to believe in God, believe in heaven, and believe it's still rock and roll if there are angels singing in the background. I'm not sure if being a traditionalist is something we're born with, like a priori knowledge, or if it's learned. If it's a priori, then it could be a genetic trait, like being left or right-handed. Nature makes sure we have enough traditionalists to keep necktie salesmen in business. I grew up in the 50s and the 60s. It was an era when everyone wanted to be a rebel, not me. I was uncomfortable with bell-bottoms. In college, being a traditionalist made me far less attractive than I could have been. I didn't have the nerve to grow a beard or wear a Che Guevara t-shirt. I grew bushy sideburns and wore shirts my mother bought me at Sears. I looked like a young Republican with poor grooming. My traditionalism had side effects. I didn't drink a beer until I was 19. I didn't smoke dope until I was in graduate school. And even for the brief period of time in which I was a drug dealer, I was a very traditional drug dealer, except for a few brief moments with Albert in the truck. Tradition gets a bad rap. People assume tradition means old news. That's not true. Traditionalists are always interested in the future. We worry about it all the time. We save money. We have children, which by definition is the future. A big part of tradition is innovation. Take Judaism. It takes a lot of imagination and creativity to make something thousands of years old new again. When I returned to Judaism in my 40s, I embraced everything that was a part of the tradition. Even for the traditionalist, it was daunting. You have to keep your head covered. I could handle that. I still had my first yarmulke Rabbi Klein gave me in first grade. I wore it when I started going to my new synagogue, Beth Meir. Rabbi Schimmel laughed when he first saw me wearing it. Let me guess, your first Simchas Torah. You had to wear prayer shawls. I recognize this is not normal, but it's not distasteful. Boys usually got a prayer shawl or talit as a gift for their bar mitzvah. I never had a bar mitzvah. I never got a prayer shawl. But at Beth Meir, they had a rack of loaners. Anyone could come in and borrow a talit for the service. Now, according to tradition, before you place the prayer shawl on your shoulders, you hold it before you and you say a prayer. It's even customary to kiss the talit before putting it in place. I found this behavior odd, but sweet. Saying a prayer is always pleasant, and from my experience as a teenage nerd, I was still grateful to kiss anything. There were stranger traditions. Tefillin. I don't know if you've seen those. They're the boxes that you wrap around your arm and place on your forehead. Inside these boxes are handwritten parchments with verses from the Torah. When I first saw tefillin, I thought, this has to be a mistake. No one could wear these contraptions on purpose. The origin of tefillin is mysterious. It's mentioned in the book of Exodus. Based on current archaeological data, tefillin date back 3,500 years. And just about all scholars agree it was an amulet. Disagreement arises as to what kind of amulet it was. In the 1st century AD, Philo of Alexandria said tefillin represent justice. They're a reminder that justice is formed in the heart and in the mind, not in the ears. Josephus, also from the 1st century, said they're instruments of gratitude. Wearing them was a way to honor God for freeing the Hebrew people from Egyptian slavery. Biblical archaeologists now suggest that donning tefillin was a hangover from a popular fashion in Egypt. Stephen Gabriel Rosenberg, senior fellow at the Albright Institute of Archaeological Research, noted that hieroglyphics depict pharaohs and some of their gods wearing similar head and armbands. Being a traditionalist is complicated. There are often traditions attached to other traditions. Besides specific prayers for each of the tefillin boxes, you're not supposed to talk while you put them in place. Talking can interrupt the spiritual connection between heart and head. If you are a traditionalist, you have to come to peace with the idea that most of the time, you don't have any idea what you're doing. When it came to not knowing what I was doing, nothing compares with learning Hebrew. This tradition requires endless amounts of work and absorption by a young brain. The only vocabulary I remember consistently is that the word agony can mean the same thing in Hebrew as in English. The tradition of learning to read Hebrew has always been a hurdle. The Talmud suggests that Hebrew was difficult even for the Hebrews. It was God's fault. The legend said that Hebrew was the root language of all languages in the world. When God confused language at the Tower of Babel, he distorted the holy tongue 70 different ways, and 70 different forms of Hebrew emerged. Language-wise, I'm still in the sub-basement of the Tower of Babel. I've taken Hebrew for years, and it continues to elude me. At the rate I'm learning, I'll be able to read fluently at the time our sun explodes. After a few years of attending Beth Meir, I memorized the service. I knew what came next by rote, and this knowledge enabled me to be a gabbai. A gabbai is someone who stands on either side of the Torah and assists with Torah reading. I did it with my friend Larry Miller. The gabbayim help with pronunciation and instruct the congregation as to where we are. Larry did all that. I stood enthusiastically across from him and covered up the Torah while Rabbi Schimmel gave me a wink. We usually didn't have much of a crowd. We were happy to get 10 people on a Saturday morning. We still felt we were connected to something important and something holy. With Judaism, you don't need popularity. Tradition validates. You're raised up by the thousands who came before you, the ones who fought battles for you, the ones who died for you, the ones who spent their lives chasing down wisdom so you could pick up a book and embrace their ideas as your own. So it was Saturday morning. I was standing on my side of the Torah, Larry on the other. We had a small group for services. The back door of our synagogue opened up, and in walked in a heavy, middle-aged man. He seemed to be in a hurry. My first thought was he knew he was late and wanted to get here for the Torah reading. He walked back to the rack of prayer shawls, pulled one off, and slung it around his neck like a scarf. Wrong. He didn't say the prayer. He didn't kiss it. Wrong, and wrong again. He was no traditionalist. He sat down and picked up the prayer book, even though we were reading from the Torah. He opened the book up randomly. He never looked down at the page. That was odd. He scanned the congregants to the right and left, then looked at Larry and me up at the bema and smiled. I sidled over to Larry and said, "That guy who came in, I got a bad feeling. I'm going to go outside and check." Larry nodded, and I excused myself. I went into the men's room and out a side door out in front of the synagogue. Outside was a nasty red Chevrolet parked in the no parking spot by the side door. Clearly, our visitor was a non-traditionalist in more ways than one. I looked in the cargo bay window. I got the chills. It was insanity on wheels. The car was filled with trash, blankets, old newspapers, cardboard boxes, the remains of several eaten takeout fried chicken dinners. I returned to my post beside Larry. "Something's wrong. Watch that guy," I said to him. Larry fixed the stranger with the look comedians give hecklers. A couple minutes later, the man stood up, pulled the prayer shawl off, and left. I followed him. Rabbi Schimmel was picking up that something was not kosher, but the service continued according to tradition. I went outside, the Chevrolet was gone. 3 days later, a gunman walked into the Jewish Community Center in Los Angeles and opened fire. He shot 3 children, 1 teenage counselor, and an adult office worker. All of them survived, even though he sprayed the lobby with machine gun fire. He met no resistance, but for some reason, he left. There were over 200 children in the facility at the time. He left the JCC and drove 20 minutes to Chatsworth, and there he murdered a postal worker, Joseph Aileto. The story was on the news that afternoon. It wasn't until later I saw his picture on television. It was our visitor. His name was Buford Furrow. He came down from Washington State, from Tacoma, with the intent to kill Jews. He went to the Museum of Tolerance, to the Skirball Cultural Center, and the University of Judaism, where I took Hebrew classes, but found the security at these places too intimidating. Somewhere along the way, he stopped for a Torah service at our little shul. 3 days later, he walked into the JCC. According to police reports, after the shooting, Furrow abandoned his Chevrolet and stole another car. He ditched that car and took an $800 cab ride to Las Vegas. And this turned out to be a successful strategy. He avoided the authorities. But then, inexplicably, he turned himself in. He walked into the FBI office and said, "I'm the guy you're looking for. I'm the guy who killed those kids in Los Angeles." Furrow said he wanted his actions to be a wake-up call for Americans to go out and kill Jews. His plan failed. Furrow made several miscalculations. A red car with out-of-state license plate filled with dynamite, easy to spot. On a more profound level, he didn't understand that most people are too lazy for genocide. After his arrest, I was left with so many whys. Why did he come to our synagogue and leave us untouched? Why did he pick the JCC and then leave when he could have killed dozens of Jews? Police said his car was filled with automatic weapons, grenades, ammunition. Why did he kill a postal worker that wasn't Jewish at all? His actions could be explained that he was insane, or that he was a white supremacist, which he was, or he just had too many people to kill in too little time. But the bottom line was, Furrow got away with it. He was a free man, and yet he turned himself in. Why? Was it ego? Conscience? Something compelled him to walk into that FBI office. Perhaps he was more of a traditionalist than he even imagined. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. 10 years later in prison, he spoke about that day. He said he knew his words meant nothing. He couldn't undo what he had done, but he regretted his actions. He said he had turned away from evil. He had turned away from hate. He felt like a weight had been lifted from his soul in prison. He respected life, all life, regardless of sex, race, and religion. The families of the victims were dubious. The general response from those he had hurt that day was, "You're right. Your words don't mean much. We appreciate your regret." But there was no forgiveness. I was surprised to learn forgiveness is not a traditional value. The Torah is not a comprehensive record. There are many gaps where we have been left to sort out the unintended consequences of Eden. One such area is forgiveness. Forgiveness has no intrinsic worth. It could be an eraser to make history vanish, releasing the same evils on the world again and again, or it can heal centuries-old wounds. Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, in his book, The Code of Jewish Ethics, Volume 1, discusses traditional Jewish values in terms of forgiveness. And this is one of the great divides in our current culture and traditional Judaism. In Judaism, there are situations in which forgiveness is forbidden. Forgiveness has a formula. You cannot forgive someone for a crime that was committed to another person. You cannot forgive a crime unless restitution is made. You cannot forgive a crime unless the perpetrator sincerely repents and asks for forgiveness. In Judaism, there are 3 crimes which cannot be forgiven: murder, adultery, and gossip. In each of these cases, there is no way to make restitution. One cannot bring back a life, one cannot bring back a family, one cannot bring back a reputation. Even family members cannot forgive. The great 12th century Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides explains the soul of the victim is not the property of family members. It is the property of God. So what does it matter that Buford Furrow cannot be forgiven? If there is no God, doesn't mean a thing. If he killed or didn't kill, if he turned himself in or went free, if he regrets the hate that filled his life or not, is meaningless. In a world without God, all that matters is if he's reloading and he's coming for you. Thank you. I think I read that Buford Furrow just passed away in prison, I think. We can Google that later. But I think. I'm going to finish with a short little story. This is from the Deuteronomy section. It's part of a longer story called The Speed of Everything. I enjoy this. This is also very true, very true. When I was 19, it was a very good year. I had a car, a girl, and a credit card which my parents paid for. Also, I had figured out the meaning of life, sort of. I settled on my first spiritual dilemma. A spiritual dilemma you stick with is almost the same thing as a belief system. And this is how it went. Either in life, everything has meaning, we just don't know what it is, or nothing has meaning, but it doesn't matter. And I found myself in both camps at various times in my life. When I was in college, I was in the meaning is everywhere camp. And to that end, I studied everything I could. 17th century Spanish theater, the Bhagavad Gita, werewolves. It didn't matter how obscure the subject matter was. I felt any little fact could provide the key that would open the door to wisdom. But one night, I went too far. I spent 3 days trying to memorize the Bowen cycle of igneous rocks while reading a biography of Bruce Lee. Something inside of me broke. I saw with blinding clarity there is no way I can know everything. In fact, no matter how hard I studied, even when I finished, it was more than likely I would still know practically nothing. It was depressing. But then I saw it as a revelation. Maybe knowing things isn't that important. Maybe life was bigger than anything I imagined, and I found this exhilarating. And I jumped over to the meaning doesn't matter camp. This is the lazy man's belief system. It has one commandment, and that is there will always be a gap between what we think we know and what is really going on, and everything we see is a product of unintended consequences. One of my favorite stories that brought me around to this way of thinking was something I read on a plane flying to England in 1974. It concerned a problem at the London Zoo. The gorillas weren't mating. The zookeepers conferred with gorilla experts. There's a job classification for you. The gorilla experts ruled out depression. The animals weren't in cages. They had space, not enough to feel like they were at home, but at least enough to feel like they were at an extended stay Marriott. The experts concluded that since gorillas learn about mating from observation in the wild, perhaps these gorillas were too young at the time of their capture to understand life's little moments that make being a gorilla worthwhile. And this is the part I love. So, at great expense to the British taxpayer, the London Zoo sent a film crew to Africa to film gorillas mating. Sort of gorilla porn films. The plan was to edit the mating scenes into an endless loop and project them at night in the gorilla enclosure, hoping the silverbacks would watch and get the idea. At the end of 6 months, none of the female gorillas were pregnant, but all of the zookeepers' wives were. I'm pretty positive that just about nothing in this story is true, except, of course, the British government making gorilla porn. But I still love this story for so many reasons. I love stories about filmmaking. I'm partial to gorillas. But at the heart of it, I knew it was true because it is an accurate description of a universe of unintended consequences. In his book of essays, The Dyer's Hand, the great poet W.H. Auden wrote a brilliant piece on comedy. And if there are any actors in there, you should get The Dyer's Hand and read Auden's essay on comedy. It's stunning. In there, Auden says that comedy arises from the tension between the vast difference between our intentions and their results. And the example he uses is of the slipping on the banana peel. Auden says the comedy reveals truth. What makes us laugh is not the fall, but the fact that the banana peel was in plain sight. The joke between slipping on the banana peel and gorillas at the London Zoo is the same. Man's inherent problem is one of vision. But vision is never simply a matter of looking. It is a matter of knowing what you see. And that leads into story number 2, and this one, I promise you, is true because I was there. 14 years after I read that article in a magazine, I was on another flight to England with my girlfriend, Anne, before she became my wife, Anne. On the flight over, she asked me if there was anything I wanted to do in particular while we were in London. I said, well, I'm always up for going to a play. Maybe we could go to the Tate Gallery. And also, if there was time, I wouldn't mind going to the London Zoo. Anne was surprised and said, the zoo? I said, well, yes. A few years back, I read this article about the gorillas at the London Zoo, and I always wanted to see the exhibit. I thought it might be interesting. Anne and I were at that blissful early stage in a relationship when you're willing to do anything your partner wants to do, even go to the zoo. So she said it all sounded good. She was happy just to be with me. We had only planned on spending 3 days in London before we rented a car to visit some of the prehistoric sites in England. Anne was a fan of Les Morts d'Arthur, which is really all you need to know about a girl. She was hot to see the ruins of Camelot. Unfortunately, we had considerably less time in London than we had planned. We spent almost all 3 days in bed. Now here I would like to wink and say we were impetuous, but we weren't. We were unconscious. We had a near terminal case of jet lag, and we fell asleep with the television in the hotel room on, playing the cricket test match of England versus Cameroon. It was on, it seemed to be 24 hours a day. It was the backdrop of all my dreams. I'm sure the people in the next room thought we were the biggest cricket fans in the world. But our inability to wake up seriously ate into our theater outings. We saw nothing. We never made it to the Tate, never made it to the British Museum. However, I woke up at dawn on day 3 and said, baby, I bet we still have time to go to the zoo. Well, Ann was a good sport. We took the tube, got off at the appropriate spot, jumped out, headed for the ticket booth. But it was like a post-apocalyptic movie. The gates of the zoo were wide open. No one was there. No one was at the ticket booth. We were pressed for time. We had to get our rental car, so I told Ann, let's go in, see the gorillas. We'll pay on our way out. We walked in. I don't know if you've ever been to the London Zoo, but it's very disappointing. It's huge. We wandered down huge pathways with rows and rows of cages, and just about every animal on display was some kind of rat. Desert rat, Siberian rat, Asian gerbil, Canadian stoat. Nothing interesting. Off in the distance, I could see a dog running in circles in the sunlight. I said, Ann, this is pathetic. This is what, a house of 1,000 rats and one dog. Off in the distance, I see a man in solid khaki wearing a pith helmet. My brain translates this as probable zoo personnel. He sees me and starts waving his arms. I see him and start waving my arms back, thinking that we could talk and he could tell me where the gorillas were and maybe we could make this visit worthwhile. At that point, the dog runs into the heart of the zoo. The man in the khaki outfit took off after the dog. I said to Ann, what do you think that was all about? Ann always wanted to look at the bright side, said, maybe the dog was rabid. You never know. Ann and I continued looking at rats and vole, mole, vole, hoping to find signs pointing to something more memorable. Then Ann grabbed my arm and said, Stephen! I stopped and looked up. 20 yards away from us, crouching under bushes, was the dog. It watched us silently. Ann and I stopped, started backing up. The dog lowered its head and leapt out of the bushes and ran right for us. The dog didn't bark or growl, but there's something in his charge that wasn't threatening. It seemed more of a celebration. In fact, he stopped halfway through, jumped, spun in a circle, landed, and kept running toward us. Suddenly, a man yelled, "Don't move!" We froze. The man in khaki came from out of nowhere. "Stand still!" Ann and I froze. The dog began to circle us. He stopped about 3 feet away, opened his mouth to yawn and stretch, and that's when I saw the dog was not a dog. It was a baby rhinoceros. He took off running again, and the zookeeper took off after the little fellow, and he said, "It's a white rhino, only a few weeks old, one of the rarest in the world. You won't see these in captivity." The baby rhino was distracted by sunlight. He thought it was alive. He became impressed with his shadow. Ann and I did not move. We could not move. We were in awe. It was probably one of the most remarkable, one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen. The zookeeper walked up to it, fed him a treat, and then put a collar on and breathed a sigh of relief. "Don't want anything to happen to this little boy. Have a good morning." Man and beast headed back up to the animal nursery, and we almost missed it all. It was a question of vision. We had a low expectation for the miraculous that day. Fortunately for Ann and me, this unintended consequence had legs. After that morning in London, I found myself back in the Meaning is Everywhere camp. Faith and science are not dissimilar. Both are dependent upon what you are inclined to see. I know this is true. I learned it from a rhinoceros. Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. David Chen.
Thank you for that, Stephen.
My
I'm
pleasure.
David Chen. I'm the co-creator. Thanks, everyone. The co-creator of the Tobolowsky Files and producer of the Tobolowsky Files. Stephen, let's start by talking about, obviously, like what most people know you from is your acting career, right? So how do you feel like your acting career has helped your writing career? Like, what skills have you applied to this new profession you're tackling?
Well, I guess the main thing is in acting, you're always dealing with stories, and usually bad stories, right? Whether it be movies and television shows. But you do get a sensitivity as to what you want to see as a person and what you want as an actor, how you want to tell that story. So in a way, I kind of channeled that into the storytelling process, trying to eliminate all the parts of the storytelling that I hate, which is generally going on too long with Act One and not keeping ahead of your audience.
Talk more about, that's something you've said before, like it's important to stay ahead of the audience. What does that mean?
When you tell a story, the audience is with you and they're 3 steps ahead. So it's very important if you're going to say something that you know that there's a twist down the road, that you're going to take them on. For example, in this last story, you have to begin with the idea of what your story is about. And then this is how the miraculous happens around us all the time, but we never witness it because we're not looking for it. We're not sensitized to seeing it. And if you know that's what your story is going to be, then you could tell the jokes about the gorillas at the beginning. But if you don't have that at the end, you can't tell the jokes about the gorillas.
A question we've received a few times is like, what's going on with the podcast, the Tobolowsky Files? Because we haven't made a new episode in quite a while. And one of the reasons for that is because you are so busy these days. I don't know if you guys know, he was recently in Silicon Valley. He's in a main lead in a Netflix show that's coming up, as well as a few other things that we can't even talk about right now. But at the same time, you've been writing this book, Adventures with God, coming out in April. So just from a pure professional standpoint, how do you balance both putting a lot of time into your acting career, but also pursuing your passion of writing? How do you maintain those two things?
Yeah, I love the podcast, and just the general word to the world is that I've written now 4 new podcasts, and we're going to start releasing them. Yeah, we're going. It's doing the Netflix show kind of inspired me because I had a lot of time off, but Netflix, they release all the things at once, right? Something like that. So I'm going to write all 12 of the podcasts, record them, get with you, and we'll finish them up. David's the man, and then we'll start putting the podcast out. But you have to have headspace to write the podcast. You have to have headspace to write anything. So it's difficult when you're learning lines for Silicon Valley or any other show to really engage yourself in doing creative work like writing. So you have to wait to a point where you're kind of over that hump. That's kind of been the problem. But I've been lucky in that I started writing Adventures with God when I was doing Californication, of all things. And it was great because in doing that show, I had a lot of time in my trailer, so I could begin writing those stories. And I had the headspace to do it. That's the important thing.
You have a really eloquent way of expressing certain concepts, like in the first story, dreams can be unreliable guides, unless they're guides with the unreliable. Like when you think of the moral or takeaway of a story, does it come out fully formed like that, or what is your process for kind of developing that kind of wordplay?
Sometimes it's lucky when my writer is at home. I mean, people who write know what I'm talking about. Sometimes your writer is at home and sometimes your writer is not at home. And when the writer is at home, you work and you write because it all comes out well. But the interesting thing about that, not only did that happen in a dream, that I had that conversation going to sleep, but in the book, there's another story, in fact, it's the final story of the book, in which I had another dream, and a character, a person who I love who had passed away, came back to me in the dream and gave me the answer and said, I have an answer to the question you asked. I said, what question? He said, years ago in Dallas, you asked, why the fear? Why the fear? I said, you're kidding. That's like decades ago. He said, well, I thought you'd want to know the answer. And so a lot of times I get answers in dreams.
So, like, what is the answer? Or are you going to, is it a cliffhanger?
It's a tease.
All right, buy his book. We're gonna take questions in a few seconds.
But for writers, keep a pad by your bed. Keep a pad by your bed, because I wake up in the middle of the night, and Anne knows now when she sees, like, she hears the scribble, she knows, like, oh, something came to me in a dream. Go.
Yeah, and that's like often how you have such a great memory, is you write everything down that's happening to you. So if you want to ask a question, please line up. But I did have one last question for you, which is regarding your work on Silicon Valley. Very funny show, very funny performance. It's like quite different than a lot of, than Californication or a lot of the other comedy that you've done. How do you kind of adjust to different directors as your, because you need to work in vastly different styles with different people, and like, what is your sort of approach to that?
Yeah, usually on a show, the most important person on the show is the executive producer. They really run the show, and they create the tone of the show. So, of course, Mike Judge, Alec Berg, executive producers on the show, on Silicon Valley, they create the tone of the show. And usually you have a director who asks the executive producers, give me some help here. How do you want this to feel? In Silicon Valley, you have Mike and Alec writing the shows, too, and directing them occasionally. So in that case, you are really speaking to the Godhead of the show, that the tone between the directing, the creation, the look of the show, the acting styles, all come from the same source. And usually on Silicon Valley, what happens is the scripts are also good. I mean, the scripts are so good. So inevitably, there is a pass in which the script is done. And we do that. And then on future passes, the script is not done. With TJ and with Thomas and those guys, then they say whatever they want to say, and that is permitted on that show, because that core group of actors on that show, they're so phenomenal, and so phenomenal to watch them work. It's great.
All right, are there any questions from the audience? Feel free to come up to one of the microphones and ask. Please phrase your question in the form of a question. And
thank you very, very much. I've made it my plan to help get the word out about you and give you as much money for what you do as possible. So I invited a lot of people.
Oh, good, thank you.
I was wondering, when you do the Tobolowsky Files, there's always a time when you're talking, you and David, and then all of a sudden, about a half an hour later, I realized, oh, David's not there anymore. You just, it's a very seamless thing, and I wondered how you made that happen. And the other question was, are you, with your book that's coming out, are you going to also have an audio version? Because that would be
I just
awesome.
talked with Audible this week, so I'll be recording the audio version of the book. And David, you want to do the first question?
So this is about a question about the podcast, the Tobolowsky Files, and there was a lot of like debating about what the format of that show would be. Originally, Stephen wanted it so that I was like reacting to him, like so that when he's telling a story, like I'm like reacting, and I did not want that, like because I think you were like using that kind of as a crutch, like if you tell a joke. If you tell a joke, you're putting yourself out there. If you're telling a joke, and there's no one laughing, like you're assuming the podcast listeners out there are laughing, it's tough. It's not an easy thing to do. But I didn't want to get between Stephen and the audience, and so that's why I kind of just vanish away after the first few seconds of the podcast, because Stephen is the main attraction, and also the story, it puts the highlight on the storytelling as opposed to the dynamic.
Yeah, but specifically answering her question, as opposed to taking a few jabs at me, it's fascinating what David does, is because he'll say, what's the story about today? And what's the first line of the story? And I'll say, the line of the first story is, in the 1970s, everybody was a drug dealer, your friends, your family, like the bargain. He said, okay, hold it. Okay, so I'll ask you a question about so-and-so, and we'll find a way in. And then David segues into a setup for me. Well, you were at Sarah Silverman's house. Did you have any pot there? And I said, well, David, it's not like in the 70s. You're too young to remember, but back in the 70s, everybody did marijuana. Yeah, and then we're into the story. But David is the guy who creates the segues in his head, which is really amazing. Really.
Thank you.
I have a question about meaning, right? And I'm wondering if, for you, any of the meanings of the stories that you have told on the podcast in the past are now different from you when you come back to listen to them or reflect on them.
Completely. That is such a shocking and brilliant question. She said about the meaning of the show, and it's terrifying that I have found that once I tell a story, it changes the reality of that event that had happened. It changes relationships. It changes the future of relationships. It changes everything. So I found that it isn't just a matter of telling a story, that once the story is told, it's like a time travel movie, and you've messed with stuff in the present that screws up the future. It changes everything, all the time.
I think one example of this is you told a story on a podcast called Conference Hour, and in that story, a teacher basically saved your career. You were about to be ejected from school, and a teacher had faith in you and saved you from school, and saved you from being expelled, basically. And later on, this person actually came to one of our live shows. That actual teacher came to one of our live shows.
Here at the Neptune, when we performed at the Neptune.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of you were there at that Neptune show.
Nice. And I think what was so compelling about that is this idea that because you tell true stories, these stories can go on. They don't just end after the podcast is over. They can go on and continue and are still alive.
And Marla Elliott, are you here tonight? Marla was another girl in that drama class, and she came up to me after that show at the Neptune and held me so hard, and she told me that the same thing happened to her, and she left show business. She left the department because she was so crushed by that teacher, the teacher being the one who was mean to me. But because that we told a real story, she felt validated suddenly. And she wrote me a huge, gigantic letter saying that seeing the true story of this got a huge weight off of her shoulders because she always felt she was never worth it, and now she saw she was dealing with someone who was crazy. And so she felt like, oh, it's okay.
Next question.
My name is Thomas Perkowski. That's Perkowski, the Polish spelling.
Nice.
I just wanted to quickly ask, and I feel like I'm outing myself up here, but how would you approach someone if they told you they couldn't equate intelligence and believing in creationism and religion? I believe Neil deGrasse Tyson maybe said 99% of people are atheists and 99% of gods. As in...
So you're saying, how do you equate the fact that you don't see any equation between faith and science.
No, right.
Correct?
Correct.
What I would say is that, from my point of view, that everybody I've met is a spiritual person, and they all see this world completely differently, and that is fine with me. You know, everybody's on their own journey, and everybody sees what they see and don't see what they don't see. And it's you remember the whole thing about dialectic? Do you remember that from Plato's Dialectics in the Republic? It's where he was saying that the only way you get to ultimate truth is through a series of questions using logic. And so I came up with this dialectic, and it was, can someone who's blind know what the color red is? And then the answer would be, well, they know what the color red is, but they haven't seen it. So does that mean because they haven't seen it, it doesn't mean that it exists? No, it exists. Or that it's not true? Well, yes, it's true. So then you're saying that all things are not knowable to all people. Yeah, I'm saying that. So then it's a universal truth that the truth is not universal. And that's what I would say. And I've been through things in my life that led me to one set of conclusions, and you've been through things in your life that lead you to another set of conclusions. And far be it from me to say one is right, one is wrong. It's just where we ended up.
All right.
I think when you said you don't know what you don't know, that helped me.
Wait, say that
When
again.
you said you don't know what you don't know, that helped.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
We have time for one last question.
Hello, Stephen and David.
Hello.
I'm so excited to just be right here. Stephen, I just wanted to tell you, you talked in the past about having heroes, and I just wanted to say really quick, though we don't know each other, you are one of my heroes, truly.
What's this?
It's- I actually do have a question because you seem so grounded and genuine. You're the genuine article, I guess you could say. How have you accomplished that? Like, you spent so much time in Hollywood. You're not a big-headed Hollywood type. How have you gotten through it? Is it because you're a traditionalist? Is that part of it?
I think it is part of it, that I'm a traditionalist. I think also the calamities I've had, you know, my broken neck,
Yeah.
and my heart surgery, and broken hearts, you know, along the way. And you realize when I was in my heart surgery, and the rabbi came into the room, and I didn't know what I was going to say to the guy. And I said, well, I learned this here in this hospital, that the past only exists in as far as we remember the past. People, places, things, when they're gone, they're gone. The future is promised to nobody in this room, and nobody in that heart ward, let me tell you. I mean, they were dropping like flies. And then the rabbi said, so all we have is the now, the present. I said, no, we don't even have the now. Because as soon as we know the now, now is gone. He says, well, if we don't have the past, present, or future, what do we have? And I said, Rabbi, all we have is the next moment. That's all we have. Now, we could do anything we want in that next moment. We could write a book. We could talk to David Chen. We could go to the movies. We could smoke some dope. We could get drunk. We could, you know, jump off a building. You do anything you want in that next moment. That's your choice. And that's what determines who you are. And I think I have a very wonderful wife. She's somewhere, I think. Yeah. Where is she? She's very grounded person, and we're able to protect ourselves in the next moment.
But he does still drop a ton of names all the time, though, so it's all good.
Not bleeding? Am I bleeding here?
I do want to mention a couple things. Stephen's newest book will be out in April. There's a release date, April 17th of 2017, Adventures with God. And if all goes well, we'll also be doing another show at the Neptune around that time. Thank you all so much for coming this evening, and please join me again in thanking Stephen Tobolowsky for his time.